Hello and welcome to Spotlight Indie. I'm HL Tinsley, your host for this evening, and today I am welcoming three very special guests to talk about an incredible indie creative project spearheaded by the wonderful master of words that is Phil Parker. This is our first of three interviews with the Realm Raiders. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is a Realm Raider? Before we jump into the details of this project and all the backstage drama to find out who's the biggest diva, who has the most insane rider, let's introduce our guests for this evening, starting with Simon. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
I'm Simon Kewen. I'm a writer of science fiction and fantasy, short stories and novels. I live in Herefordshire, south of Shropshire.
Patrick.
Yeah, I'm Patrick Zamfar. I'm mainly a fantasy writer, occasionally a little bit of science fiction for both adults and children. And it occurred to me like 30 seconds ago that I probably should have brought along a book to hold up to the camera. One of the things I write, but never mind. Never mind. It's a degree of professionalism you can expect here, I think.
We'll put one in post-edit. It's fine. We've got you covered. Don't worry. And last but certainly not least, Ed.
Hello. I'm Ed Crocker. I've also not got my own book near me. So it's a real theme here. Maybe I'll get it at some point. I currently write epic fantasy. I'm writing an epic fantasy trilogy called The Everlands, vampires, werewolves, and sorcerers in epic fantasy, but no humans. First book came out in America in January, Lightfall. I also review SFF and horror for Grimdark Magazine and Fantasy Addict. And I think that's me.
Awesome. So people who are watching this will obviously already know you as very talented authors and creatives. However, you are also now known as Realm Raiders. So for anyone that's watching this who hasn't seen all of the different posts and videos on social media through Spotlight Indie, tell us a little bit about what is Realm Raiders. Simon, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, so the idea was we had all these wonderful writers and me, and we wanted to come up with a collaborative story, a serial story. And the idea came to us that if we all wrote our own characters in our own world, effectively, that was the starting point. Give them all a problem, set them all off, let them rampage around in the realms, do their own thing, and then at some point bring them all back together and solve the problem that they've all been given. So it was a way of reconciling different writers with different styles, different voices, different approaches to fantasy fiction, I think. Giving people the freedom to do what they want.
So one of the things that I know, obviously, from doing my background research, because I'm a very professional host and I like to know about a project before I talk about it, is the way that you've done it is you've obviously split into three different teams. So we're doing 3 videos with 3 different groups of you. So what was that process like of deciding whose author voices would work best with whose, and how was that decided? Patrick, I'm going to come to you for that one.
You know what? I have no idea about that, Holly, because I don't recall any discussions about that other than finding myself in the same group as you and Simon initially, and then Ed joining us later. So, who knows? Who knows?
I can answer that question. It was like the senior football teams at school. So everyone lined up on the pitch, and I said, "Oh, I'll have him," and so on and so on. I don't know what it means that you will.
Phil, in the end, who decided this? Our boss, Phil.
I honestly can't remember how it worked. It just happened organically.
There was a voice from on high that belonged to Phil Parker who said, "You're in this team and you're in this team," and it was all done through that higher level of consciousness that Phil has.
Yes. The important thing to know is that we are the A team.
Yes.
We are, definitely.
And then there's
my recollection of how it all started is Phil said, "Do you want to be involved in something?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" And the next thing I knew, I was writing a not a novel. Phil tells us this is not a novel.
No.
This is a serial something or the other online thing, which is about the length of a novel and has a beginning and a middle and an end, but is not a novel.
Yeah.
But Phil is very firm about this.
Yes, so I want to dive into a little bit about like what the project actually looks like in a second, but just talk a little bit about the teams again. So obviously you've all been working together on this project. How has that manifested itself? I mean, is this now a democracy? Is Simon now the leader of this team and is the commander of all decisions? How does this work as a group dynamic?
We kind of when we did it initially, we kind of did it as a bit of a tag team. So one person wrote the first chapter, the second person then read that chapter and wrote their chapter, and then the third person, which in this case was me, got the first two chapters and then wrote another chapter. But as we were each writing from the point of view of our own characters, it was more about, I think, just following on the storyline that had been set up and taking it in your own direction.
I had, and you might have to edit this out because I don't know if you want your role to be known in this, Holly. So feel free to edit this out. But I mean, it's hard to say my origin story without involving you, because I kind of came on because you were doing a chapter, and then you were not doing a chapter. And then Phil was like, "Oh, do you want to, join this thing?" Holly can't do a chapter anymore, and then I realized when I kind of came on board that I was going to be like rewriting your chapter, and I got really excited because I don't know, make you blush, but like I'm a big fan of yours, of your writing, of your Grimdark books, and I was like, one of my things is that I've never really got to do is that I love the idea of working with another writer, partly in a way that I've been working with Simon and Patrick and doing 3 connected chapters, which is very cool. But then what I got to do as like a bonus side quest mission with you was that I got to like rewrite a chapter that you'd already done a lot of great work on, and you were like, "Oh, I'm just rewrite it, just it's all trash." And then I looked and it wasn't trash, it was brilliant. I was like, this is really good, I'm not like throwing any of this away. So I just like doubled it, and then I just kind of went in and like tweaked your sentences and just added my weirdness to it, probably made them worse. And this is just a long rambling side quest, but that was very cool for me because I respect you a lot as a writer. We're very similar writers, I would say. And that was just as an author kind of task. It was such a fun, creative task that I never get to do. So that was my introduction to it. And then obviously then I wrote this and I was like, Simon Patrick, does this work? And then we made sure that kind of flowed together, and they were like, yeah, that's okay. And there were a couple of plot bits that didn't quite work, so we kind of just slightly changed it. But yeah, that was very cool for me. That was really fun.
Well, first off, thank you very much for the lovely compliments. I'm deeply uncomfortable now, so we'll move on quickly. But I do appreciate them.
You're British, so I knew you'd be uncomfortable.
Yes, yeah. Tea, crumpets, cricket. But just to jump onto that a little bit more, because obviously it was a little bit of a different situation for you coming into the project a little bit later and having to kind of pick up what, not just what I had written in the chapter I'd started, but also what Simon and Patrick had written as well. Did you find that difficult in terms of wanting to kind of bring your own flavour into it? And then did you feel like there was any barriers to you be able to do that? Or did you feel that there was the freedom to add your own spin on it?
No, I very much felt within reason I could basically do what I want. And that was partially a product of everyone's very friendly. If I didn't really know anyone and you're coming into a writer's room where you don't really know the writers, and obviously you're going to be quite conservative, I think. But I knew a few people already, and then in the group chat, Simon and Patrick were very friendly, and so I basically felt like I can kind of just do what I want. And then, but as I said before, when I got into the chapter, I was like, well, I don't need to just reinvent the wheel, because Holly's writing is very similar to mine. I think we have that kind of sort of dark, trying to be funny constantly thing going on.
Trying being the operative word.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a style I recognize very much. So it was very much a case of I don't need to reinvent the wheel, I just need to kind of follow on from this. And I didn't feel like if I was too sort of trying to be funny or just too outlandish that anyone would say no, because I felt like it was all a kind of creative space where you can kind of just do what you want. So it's kind of stress-free, really. It was almost like there's no rules as long as I follow the basic plot. So it was great.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about this, because although it's a collaborative work between 9 authors, it's also a very at least the first half of the book, the way it's been set up structurally has given basically all of the authors a lot of freedom in what they want to do and what they want to write. It's a story which starts off with 9 separate characters, most of whom are in different realms, different universes, or whatever, different dimensions, and they're slowly coming together over a common thing. So everyone basically got to make up a world, a situation, without being really that dependent on what the other people had done. It was probably slightly harder for Ed because the 2 chapters that came after his had been written at that stage, and so maybe got slightly less freedom than the other authors who kind of may have slightly abused it. I feel like I abused the freedom by what I chose for my chapter, but there we are.
I think that's a really good point, Patrick, because it's a real double-edged sword, this sort of writing, because as I was writing my chapter, which came between Ed's, Holly's, and yours, Patrick, obviously, I was partly thinking I need to follow on from chapter 1 because I'm writing chapter 2 in this little section. But when it comes to chapter 3, I'm split between wanting to leave something open for you to work with and throwing you a complete curveball that will make you think, what the hell am I going to do with that? And I'm not sure what I came up with. I think was a bit of both. I just tossed in some interesting ideas, which I didn't have to resolve particularly. So it was fun to write in that regard. So I just sort of created these interesting ideas, what seemed interesting to me, and then just left them for the next chapter, which is some other writer, Patrick, to do something with, which you did ably. You did fantastically well.
Yeah, one of the interesting, because although we're 9 separate writers writing 9 chapters, as Holly said, we're divided into 3 groups. And within those 3 groups of 3 chapters, there's a kind of story arc. So yeah, but doing the 3rd chapter was kind of interesting because there was taking the 2 characters that had already been introduced, introducing a new character, and then trying to bring the story of all 3 of them to a kind of to the end of the part 1 arc. So it was it was definitely an interesting thing to do. But despite that, I felt like there was an awful lot of freedom within the overall structure and context of the story that we'd agreed between the 9 of us and Phil earlier on. That you weren't limited in the way that maybe we would have done if we were just writing one chapter after another of a conventional structured novel.
Yeah. Okay.
So I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the project, because as Patrick has mentioned, this is not a conventional project in the sense that it is a book that everyone is collaborating on. This is going to be a serialized, web-based fictional series that is going to be posted through Spotlight Indie, shared on socials, and hopefully lots of people are going to read and enjoy it. My question for you as a group is, what do you feel like the appeal of a project like this is, as opposed to doing something like a more traditional anthology or collaborative project where you're just putting out a singular project?
Do you mean appeal in terms of for the audience or for us as writers?
Oh, I mean both. Whichever perspective you want to come from.
I mean, go on, Simon. Go first.
Well, I was just going to say, as having read the contributions of everyone else, what's fascinated me is all the different voices and the different authorial styles that have come through in the work. And obviously, as writers, we try to produce different. Our characters all have different voices and different characteristics. But there are certain characters in it and certain situations that I don't think I could have written, and which I've learned from. And I've thought it'd be quite nice to write like that. So you do get this sort of, it is like a fantasy party with all different characters with different skills and abilities, but they all have very, very different voices and personalities and approaches to life. And I find that quite refreshing.
And it's also quite interesting to see how people take in these very different types of characters in different settings, like you say, with different voices, and yet bringing them all together in this overall story and this overall structure. And there is a lot of variety. There are some people who did very grimdark stuff. There are people who did comedy. There are people who did more traditional epic fantasy. But despite that, I think it's surprising how well it all came together. I think when we all sat down and read the 9 chapters written by everyone, that it actually did come towards this midway point of the story and brought everyone together in a way that kind of makes sense. So I was kind of impressed. I have no idea whether this was Phil's good planning or pure luck or what it was.
I think it was the writer's skill. I don't think Phil had anything to do with it.
Give no credit to Phil. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. What was the question again, Holly? How does it appeal to readers or us or both?
So I was asking about, what is the appeal of doing something like this where it's a serialized web fiction as opposed to something like an anthology?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be ego for a second, the appeal to me as opposed to the reader is that like collaboration, I'm normally suspicious of collaboration because I'm quite an introvert. You'll be shocked to hear. And like I'm a lone wolf. I like to do, I'm all about control and I like to do things by myself. And traditionally, I'm not particularly tolerant of incompetence, even though I'm ironically very incompetent myself. It's a great hypocrisy that lies within me, that defines me. So I find traditional publishing quite hard, for example. Obviously, that's a topic for another day. But what was nice was that I discovered that those things don't really matter when you're collaborating on something where it's not overly strict. There are rules, but everyone's quite flexible, and the people engaged in the rules are very open to everyone's ideas, and no one's kind of ready to kind of come down. So I think it matters who you're working with, and I think it matters how strict the rule procedure is. This has been quite sort of loosey goosey, I would say, and I mean that in a good way. If it was more kind of strict, like, oh Ed, I like your chapter, but you need to put the rules of Gog back in there, I'd be like, well, just all right, so leave it alone. But but if it's like, oh, the plot point, can you just change that? That's absolutely fine. So I think for me, what it's shown is that collaboration with authors on a project where everyone's involved in a plot, and yet there's still a bit of flexibility there, is not as scary as I thought, and it's something that I quite like to do going forward. I don't always need to be Captain Lone Wolf of the Lone Wolf Enterprise.
I think that's really good to hear, Ed, as well. I mean, I'm the same. I think there's something I've found that's quite liberating about having a few rules, which surprises me because I also don't like being told what to do, and I'm also an introvert. But it's that if you stare at a blank page and you have to write something, you can write anything, and it's just quite intimidating. Whereas if you start off with a rusty sword in the corner of a blacksmith's forge, you've immediately got something to hang on. I found that so much easier to write as that with just something as a starting point.
And I think part of it for me was also the fact that although it's Phil Parker put this together, it never felt like it was Phil's project that we were contributing to. It always felt like everyone it was open for everyone to put their own ideas and to come to their own conclusions about. And so I think we worked pretty well together as an overall team and coming up with a structure, a vague structure, and a world that it happens within. But it wasn't restrictive at the same time. So we could choose to write very, very different things. But also because it didn't. Sometimes it's easier when it doesn't belong to you as well. Because when a book belongs to you and it's your idea and you've come up with everything, then in some ways that's a lot harder to write because you're carrying everything. Yeah. Whereas this, you're part of something and you get to make up your own thing, but it's only part of it. And and then you get to see what someone else does with it afterwards, which is quite fun.
Yeah, I like Simon's description of it being like a big indie party, and really that's what it is to me. That's what I'm excited about for the project. It is a celebration of many different voices and styles of indie creators all coming together and sharing a common theme, but all doing their own individual thing. So I'm going to put you slightly on the spot now, because I know you've all had many meetings with the larger group and the other writers involved, and you've all seen various chapters. So of what you've seen so far, whose chapter of the authors not in this group have you been really excited by?
Well, I was talking about the voices that I thought I couldn't have written, but I would quite like to write. So there are some sort of more grimdark style chapters in the other groups that are quite sort of sweary and violent, which I find immensely satisfying to read and liberating. And I tend not to write in that style, but it made me want to write in that style. So I guess because they're kind of not what I wrote, so I guess anybody else's approach I just found refreshing. So I find it hard to pick one. I'd enjoyed them all, but I think those sort of grittier, grimdarky ones worked for me.
And I'm going to sound terrible now because I'm getting all people's chapters smushed in my head. But the one with Simon and Patrick can tell me, the one with the set of 3 chapters with Nikki, the characters Nikki, Yaz, and I was about to say a plot point, then don't say plot point live. The one who gets something happens to them and they get something might happen to them.
The one where something happens to someone. That was my favourite too.
Something happens to someone. Which is the first 3 we encounter. That was quite. That was very comedic, which I think Simon was getting at, and I enjoyed that as well, because sometimes I'm a little bit skeptical as to how comedy can kind of come across when it's almost, I wouldn't say it was slapstick, but it was kind of it was a little bit Discworldy, early Discworldy, kind of going across the desert, and then you kind of come across I was about to say another plot point, but you come across kind of characters that seem a bit kind of parody, almost like parodies, and that can go too far. But the way all 3 of them wrote it, and the styles are surprisingly similar, so they must have really kind of coalesced, really made sure their voices were similar. It kind of got away with that and was actually just kind of fun, kind of serious but fun, if that makes sense. And I'm not very good at that, because I would just always go like witty dialogue, but like horrible things happening around. And I'm always trying to make myself less dark, but I always kind of end up being dark. So it was nice to see maybe learn from how to do comedy that doesn't make it seem unserious, if that makes sense. So so that was what I liked. So that's so vague. Like, don't say plot points.
Yeah, and I would say again, I like. I know it's being a bit wishy-washy, but I did like all of the chapters by the other groups, and I, as well as what Ed was saying for the group that comes for us, the group that is after ours in the story, did some things to their characters that I wouldn't have thought about doing. Let's put it that way. I wouldn't have done to the characters, and it worked really well. And it was kind of, I wouldn't necessarily have had the courage to do that to my character. I get a bit protective about my characters sometimes, so it's really cool to be part of a story where that's happening, whereas it probably wouldn't happen in one of my stories, and that's incredibly vague, I know, but it's really hard to talk about these without doing any spoilers at all.
Well, I give you all full bonus points for getting through that question without mentioning any names whatsoever and without spoiling anything. So we'll see if you can keep it going for the next question, because I want to move slightly more into your story and your chapters. So we do have to be very careful not to spoil anything, because obviously these are going to go out weekly. But what can you tell us about kind of the themes within your chapters, or any kind of overarching elements of the story?
Do you want to go first, Ed? Your chapters first.
Yes, go on, Ed.
I'm the first chapter. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So okay, let's not spoil stuff. So the character that you're introduced to in my chapter, can I say his name, or is that a spoiler?
I think so. I don't think that's a spoiler.
Okay, that's not a spoiler. So Lute a guy called Loot, and he lives. This isn't a spoiler, but like, he lives in a small village. He's a blacksmith, and what I like about or found interesting what I was writing, which I hope readers will find interesting, is that it's very much an introduction to him. But, and again, this is credit to Holly because she's started the story off. But I like origin stories of people who are in fantasy villages and they have a rubbish life and they go to the tavern and they have the kind of slightly annoying stupid friend, which he has, and they're just drinking and they've heard about all these amazing faraway places where all the crazy plants are and all the weird wizards are, whatever. He knows he's never going to see them, and that's a theme throughout the story, this idea of just sort of knowing there's places out there, but you're stuck with this inherited life that you've had as a blacksmith. And I really like that in fantasy lands. And then possibly there's always a point where that changes. I don't think that's a spoiler. But sort of that kind of slightly sarcastic, slightly sort of like, oh god, this is all a bit rubbish. That was a really fun character story for me. So I think for my chapter, if you like sort of just witty asides, witty Pratchett asides, and a character in a shit life, but then the hope of something more, and discoveries that might get you beyond the village, then that's sort of that's kind of what that chapter's about. And it was fun to write. I'm already quite attached to that character, which may or may not be a wise thing to do.
So I wrote the chapter following on from that chapter, and what I wanted to do there was, I mean, that beginning that Ed's described is fantastic and really provides the perfect starting point. But I wanted to kind of then open out the world a bit. The overriding story is called Realm Raiders, so spoilers, there are different realms, and I wanted to kind of introduce the sort of wow factor, the idea of traveling between the realms and this whole unknown magical world or set of worlds that Loot sets off into. But obviously, the trick with any writing, I mean, it's very easy just to write some facts, but what you're trying to do is create an interesting character that reveals all that stuff for you. So I eventually wrote a character called Morin Hast, who is in some senses an archetypal wizard. He's stuck in a tower, although it's a slightly odd tower, and he's been doing his magical researches all this time, and without revealing what's happened to him or what he's been doing. He's kind of a grumpy old git, basically. He's quite annoying in that sense. So I don't know where that idea of a grumpy old man came from. It's not something I'm experienced in at all, but I thought it'd be quite funny to have a sort of cantankerous, slightly cross, annoying, sort of grumpy character who's just swearing at people and fed up with having to go and bloody well go and save the realms again and all this sort of stuff. So that was where he came from. So I just started with, when I wrote the first sort of third of the chapter from Loot's perspective, I think. So Loot finds my character, as it were, and then I switched to my character seeing Loot through his eyes and thinking, oh God, who's this guy now? That was something I quite enjoyed. So Loot seeing my character, and then my character seeing Loot, and giving a different perspective on those two. And then I just tried to open it up into this big, wide, exciting world with some hopefully cool ideas for Patrick to go and sort out in his chapter, and let them head off into the realms.
Yeah, and for mine, what I wanted to do, because I felt like we were quite firmly in the realm of high fantasy, epic fantasy at this stage, is I kind of just wanted to fuck that up a bit, but also to kind of expand beyond this fantasy universe. So without hopefully too many spoilers, I decided to move it to this world, or at least a version of this world, in roughly the 1980s, and a character who rather than taking part in or being willing to take part in the quest, has said, "Fuck it, I'm out of there." And part of the chapter then, obviously, is these two well-meaning, if somewhat grumpy, people turning up and meeting the person who ought to be helping them, who is saying, "Screw it, I just want to make a profit here." And then having to take that all three of them to the bit that Simon so very kindly set up for me.
I'm sorry.
And get it through there. So it was quite a fun challenge. But I also wanted to take like I said, the fantasy story because it is supposed to be a large number, possibly an infinite number of realms, of universes. I wanted to take it to, I mean, I don't want to give away too much of the overall story, but I wanted to take it to a part of these universes where magic had stopped working and where things were, the connection to the rest of the universes had rather crumbled away, which comes as part of the overall plot. So I was quite pleased to take it somewhere quite different, and I think this is part of what I was saying about the flexibility of this. Is it was a story that was set up that you could do that, you could take them where you wanted them. And some of the other groups did similar things of taking their characters to quite different universes, of quite different realms.
See, now I love that idea of jumping from a high fantasy setting into something that is in the 1980s. And obviously it does really open up those different worlds to explore. But of course, all these worlds and stories do need a common theme. And it's not a spoiler because it has been revealed through the videos and the posts on social media. But for each group, you are working with a specific, it's fair to say artifact, is that the word we'll go for? So tell me a little bit about, not so much the again, no spoilers about kind of what the purpose of it is or what it's for, but what is the artifact that your group is working with, and how did you all decide who was going to have kind of what to run with?
Do you want to, I mean, I'm not revealing much when I say it's a magical sword for us.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, I suppose, a fairly standard fantasy trope. But what was interesting for me was how we threaded that object through our three different stories. So Ed's character, Lute, as a blacksmith, my character as a wizard, Patrick's character as what he's just explained. Somehow we needed to spin all of those stories around this kind of mythical, magical sword that we needed to recover, which I found quite enjoyable.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for me, it was trying to decide, because inevitably in my chapter we're getting to the part where we have to recover this magical artifact. So for me, it was deciding who basically had what role in the recovery and use of this thing, and I thought that was quite an interesting challenge, trying to take these three characters and think what's their function here, what are they, why are they here, what are they doing here, and what's going to happen when they get to the point of trying to retrieve it. And it worked. For me, it worked very, very well. I don't think we had planned it particularly, but we had these three character archetypes, and to me, they fitted quite well with what was needed to make that work.
I was just going to say in my chapter there was just very briefly in my chapter there was a brief section where basically my character is wondering where the sword has got to, and he runs through some of the sort of standard cliches of where magical swords might have got to, lobbed into lakes or buried into rocks with the handle sticking out or stuff. And those are all ridiculous rumors that he dismisses and then works out where the sword actually is, which was part of the curveball that I threw to Patrick. So it was kind of fun to start with the cliche and then break it, really, I think. Sorry, Ed, you were saying.
No, just sort of similar thing about cliches, really, because I think there is a potential problem when you do magical objects in fantasy stories, because it's such a cliche that you've got two choices. I think you can either just use it as a sort of MacGuffin. Am I using MacGuffin in the right way? As sort of like an object that is not, it's just there. It's not meant to be discovered as the object. It's just there to kind of, move the plot along. And then you can kind of play around with that, maybe acknowledge it, be like, well, who cares? Or the object can become really important to the story, and then you can examine the use of the object. And I think, and again, I can't really say this without explaining the plot, but I think both things potentially happen by the end of the whole story, in the sense that I think there's clever things done that you don't necessarily see in the first of our three chapters, because it's very much about finding the object. But then in the ones that we're the currently writing, the last set, which I obviously won't spoil, but the nature of the objects becomes both important and not important, he says, in the vaguest possible terms. And I think so I think we've avoided, hopefully, the idea of just like, oh god, it's just to search some magical objects, very original. It's you got to play twist on that, and you got to sort of throw a little few curveballs in there. I think we've done that pretty well, so I'm glad we've avoided the cliche.
And again, you've all done very well to avoid my sneaky attempts to trip you all up into spoilers. However, I want to talk a
Interview
little
with
bit.
Holly is a minefield, isn't it?
It is. It's like psychological games. So where
I like it.
No one's a winner. But let's just jump a little bit into kind of your experience as individual writers with this project. You've kind of touched on this a little bit before, with Ed talking about, discovering that, he can play well with others. What do you think you've learned from doing something like this about yourselves as authors, or kind of what new skills do you think you've unearthed through this project?
I think for me, I don't tend to write heroes. My characters tend to be people who are trying to do good, but they're very rarely heroic. And it was really interesting for me to actually take on people who are heroes, particularly the character that Ed was writing, Lute, who really is a fantasy hero, and get to write a bit of that myself in the chapter I did, because, like I said, it's not my normal route for writing. And yeah, it was quite fun, and sometimes it's quite liberating, I think, to write a kind of character you don't normally write, and say, well, screw it, I'm going to write a hero here, and he's going to do something heroic. And I still get to write Simon's character, the grumpy old wizard, and I get to write my cynical, burned out character as well, but I get to write a hero. And yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, I just echo what Patrick said, really. I've noticed over the years that my characters tend to be, if I'm not careful, they all tend to be decent, nice, worthy, kind, thoughtful people, which is all very well, but it's pretty boring. But then, and I try not to do that, obviously. But there are some characters in here who are not that, who are a bit, oh, fuck it, let's just go and do that. And I find that immensely liberating, as I say, but also makes me want to write like that sometimes as well, because it's fun. So I think the fun aspect of it is what has struck me, is what I've learned from it as a writer.
Yeah, and I quickly add as well that in the second part of the novel, which we all tried not to talk about at all, not novel, online serial story, sorry. The not a novel. In the second part of it that we're all about to start writing, or have started writing in some cases probably, characters are getting mixed up, which I think is going to then open all of us to get to write some other characters from these teams who have done things really quite differently, either in a comic way or a grim, dark way. And that's what I'm looking forward to most, I think, in that next part, is a chance to again write some characters that are quite different, and maybe some storylines that are quite different to the ones I would normally write.
It perhaps says something about me, but there are grimdark characters that I'm quite looking forward to animating. But there's also some romantasy characters which scare the hell out of me. I don't. I mean, that will be interesting. But yeah, never done that.
Was the question what was been most fun or what have we learnt?
I mean, you can answer both, Ed.
If I had to answer what? So you're probably thinking, why does Ed keep forgetting the question? Is because when the time goes past like 7 o'clock, my brain switches off, and I have the memory of a goldfish. I'm like, oh, anyway, sorry, yeah. I'll answer both as punishment for forgetting the question. So what? The most fun, and I'm sorry to repeat myself or make you blush, Holly, but the most fun has been literally building on another writer's sentences. So what I sometimes do, and this sounds really pathetic, and I can't believe I'm admitting it, but I take my favorite authors, I sit down for like an hour or two on a weekend, and I try and write a very short story, almost flash fiction, I guess, in their voice. So I try and mimic their syntax, and if it's a bit rubbish, maybe the next week I'll try again. So I've mimicked their voice. It's like a creepy sociopathic addiction, I would say. And what I got to do with you is I got to do that live writing on top of some of your sentences, changing them, adding to them, trying to change the jokes, trying to like embody your. This sounds so creepy. I'm so sorry. Embody your syntax.
To wear her face, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. And that was so much fun. And yeah, so that's the last time I'm bringing it up, but that's honestly been the most fun. In terms of what I've learned, I feel like my learning's about to happen because without giving away kind of what the other two just said, but without giving anything away, it's getting a bit more mixed up in the last few chapters, and I'm not sure which part I'll be writing yet. But there's a chance I might be dealing with a larger ensemble, and I love ensemble writing. But then I've got to be true to how previous people treated the characters. So I feel like, or there might be a very sad scene that I, fingers crossed, might get to write. You never know, with a certain character, and. So I think my big learnings is about to come when I've got to balance all these things that have happened and then maybe deal with an ensemble cast and try and do justice. So I think I have had the easy bit first, which is just kind of, doing a half Holly. And now I'm about to kind of go into the real grindstone of it. So I think my learnings to come.
I mean, I can safely say I don't think I've ever had anyone try to embody my syntax before. And that is something that I am absolutely 100% here for. I want to talk a little bit about realms, because obviously you are realm raiders, and you are all not only authors, but avid readers in your own right. So as we smoothly glide into the last section of this chat, I want to ask you about some of the worlds and realms that have inspired you in your work. I'm going to jump straight to Simon on this one, I think.
Okay. I mean, I partly think we should jump straight to Ed so he doesn't forget the question, but that's fine. I find that a really hard question to answer because I've been reading, as I'm sure we all have, reading and watching this stuff since before we could remember. As a tiny boy, many years ago, I was reading portal fiction and science fiction and fantasy and jumping between the worlds, and that's always just seemed completely normal to me to want to do that. And I don't know where that started. I guess it all just came from wanting to flee the mundane real world. And I just, I've read so many books over the years where the fantasy characters head off into fantasy worlds or science fiction characters head off into different planets. And I find it hard to identify one particular one, really. I mean, they're all just in there somewhere, and they come out. I think I may have forgotten the question now. Which realms did you like? Or?
Yeah, favorite fantasy realms through fiction. Any worlds that have stood out to you?
I mean, if I had to pick one, and I always say this, if somebody ties me down and forces me to answer a question like that, I always say Ursula Le Guin. So the Earthsea books for me, I mean, I loved her science fiction as well, but her fantasy books, which I read as a boy, just blew me away. I mean, just the sheer quality of the writing and the imagination and the believability of it and the horror and the tragedy and the beauty of it just stuck with me. And if I'm trying to emulate anyone or reach towards anything, it's something like that. And I'm sure I'm nowhere that good, but it's Earthsea for me that was the books that really got me. I think they're just marvelous.
So I just want to second the Earthsea. I love those books so much. They're very influential on me as well. But in terms of, I'm going to say Discworld, which is maybe a bit of a cliche answer. I love Discworld deeply, and it's like, even when I've been writing these chapters, it's a big influence on me. And people who aren't Discworld fans, I have to sort of explain this to them, because there's a difference to me in Discworld. There's early Discworld, which is useful for this because it's a parody essentially. The early Discworld books are essentially sort of comedic parodies, but Discworld's basically fundamentally is why I write, and the later Discworld books is sort of my style really, which is when it gets a bit more serious and it starts to be like a very serious society, but still with a comedic angle and like characters who are constantly kind of taking the mick within this very serious society. And that realm, and it does feel almost like Realm Raiders in the sense that there's so different parts of Discworld that you kind of bounce around. So it's quite an interesting comparison. But like the City Watch books of Discworld, which is like a sort of more serious police kind of procedural kind of series, they are my kind of starting point when I started writing a few years ago, and I've sort of built off that. So whenever I think of Realms or Fantasy Realms, I just always go back to particularly that series, City Watch series of Discworld books. That idea of very serious philosophical and political and societal themes with a little bit of wit in there and a little bit of kind of less parody than the earlier books, but still a bit of parody. I think those for me are the ultimate fantasy world I sort of always go back to, really.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because rather like Simon, I've been reading fantasy for as long as I can remember, and at my age that's quite a long time, and I have this kind of it will kind of disappears into this fog of half remembered children's fantasy stories. So it's always been something, and science fiction as well, although less so these days, I must admit. So yeah, my early influences kind of very much shaped everything. While I can't necessarily always remember what those books were called or who wrote them or the specific details, it's more kind of a feeling. And the first books that when I decided to start writing my first book when I was 17, which luckily is long lost and hopefully burned, but it was very similar to Ed's in that I basically ripped off Terry Pratchett. I think I ripped off his first 2 Discworld books horribly. I think I mixed in a bit of some dubious Piers Anthony stuff, which horrifies me now that when I look back at the kind of things he wrote. But yeah, and so that's kind of my where I started my writing. But it's, in terms of style, though, I think my biggest influence is probably not from science fiction or fantasy. It's probably Elizabeth Peters, who wrote Crocodile on the Sandbank and various other mysteries, which are fantastic stories. And I recommend them, and I think they're probably my biggest influence. But yeah, in terms of there's books that kind of influence what I love about fantasy, and then there are books that influence what I kind of write, and they're not really the same things necessarily, because the things I really do love are things like Tolkien, things like Ursula Le Guin, things like George Martin, and I don't write anything like that at all. They're just not what I try and write, and not what I suspect not what I'm capable of writing either. So yeah, I'm not sure I've come up with a very good answer to this at all.
No, it's great answers.
The other author that was in my head as I was thinking about Realm Raiders specifically was Michael Moorcock. So I mean, I used to read the Eternal Champion books avidly as a boy. You know, I would just devour them. And there's something of that, I think, in this story, because he would have quite similar worlds, and he would have quite similar characters. Then he'd have a parallel world which is closely related but not quite the same, and a different set of characters. But are they the same character? You're never really sure, which I absolutely loved as a boy. I love that idea of stepping between the worlds and finding sort of something that's both familiar and magically different at the same time. So there was something of that in my thinking as well, I think.
No, I love that. And I think there's some really great examples there. I mean, I can't think of many authors that I know who haven't been inspired, at least in some way, by Ursula Gwynn or Terry Pratchett. However, this is Spotlight Indie, so I am going to have to throw out a few indie author shout outs in terms of fantastic world building. So for me, I want to just mention P.L. Stewart's world building in his Drowned Kingdom saga. That is a richly complex, layered world with all sorts of good and bad people, political intrigue and systems and hierarchies going on that is just so wonderfully well fleshed out. And also Crystal Matar, the Brightwash, and her stories based around the Dominion, again, just so beautifully laid out and complex and richly woven. So I'll just give them a little mention, because we are Spotlight Indie and we do like to plug the indies while we can.
I'll throw out a couple then in that case, because
go on.
The two that really got me into indie books and reading indie books, because I was probably a slightly late convert to indie books and may have had a slightly cynical view of them initially. The ones that got me into it were Rob Hayes and Dirk Ashton, and reading their books and thinking these are as good, if not better, than any traditionally published books I've ever read. Kind of opened me to the idea that there's a lot of good stuff out there in indie publishing, and it's a matter of finding it, because there's a lot of indie published books, and finding the ones that are brilliant can be a little difficult. But once you discover how to do that, then you're really open to an awful lot of really great books. And I'd probably read about 50% indie, 50% trad published at this stage.
Are we just naming all some indie fancy, or does it have to be world building that we're centering
I mean,
on?
at this point, we could just mention really awesome indie authors. It's fine.
Okay. Well, to be fair, the one's going to mention do awesome world building. And I'm like Patrick. I'm about 50-50 indie trad at the moment. Michael R. Fletcher does incredible world building. He's sort of known as a bit of a kind of grimdark king. I'll tell you what. The one at the moment, the one who I just think is about 5 years younger than me. He's just going to turn into like a legend. C.M. Kaplan, whose sequel Diplomacy the Knife has just come out, which is absolutely phenomenal. His world building is just kind of like science fantasy, just sort of absolutely insane, but then with powerful kitchen sink drama within that. And then I'll just throw out, I should have this list in my head, because people always say, oh, indie books, and then I just have all these I want to say. I'll just say one more. N.C. Scrimgeour, in terms of world building, is one of the most impressive world building. Who's created this kind of Sea of Soul saga, second one, Mr. Memory, just recently came out. This sort of 18th century flintlock folklore Scotland style country with sea monsters, but also like if Scotland had been better at ships. And yeah, all three of these indie authors and many more. Just I feel like the world building aspect as well. You can kind of it's a little bit. You can be a bit more wild in indie at the moment. I think there's some quite rigid ones I'm seeing in trad at the moment. So yeah, there's just so many out there.
We will link all of the authors that are mentioned in the description and the comments and on socials, so that everyone can find them. But as we are starting to run a little low on time now, I want to just move into my very last section of the chat tonight, which is, you'll be pleased to hear, a little game, which I have called Real or Realm. So I'm going to mention a few places, and your challenge is to tell me whether you think this is a real place in the world or a fictional place in an indie author's book.
Okay. Nice.
So we'll see how well you do. First up.
Ed, you're going first.
I mean, you can all. This is
What was the
a
question
group
again?
thing.
Let's just
It's a
vote on
group
it.
thing. Apocalypse Peaks, real or realm?
Both.
Realm.
Sounds real to me. That's got to be like some crazy
Are we allowed to give
museum
all the
place or
answers?
something.
I should have said at the beginning, this is all based on my very quick Google search 10 minutes before this video started. So
Yeah.
it may well be that some of these places are both real or realm, but we'll go with my answers. Apocalypse Peaks is a real place and it's in Antarctica.
Ooh, nice. There you go.
Yeah. Okay. Number 2, Dollarbeg, real or realm?
Dollarbeg.
Mhm.
I know near where I was born, there was a village called Ballabeg. So I'm going to say
I'm going
real.
to say real because
Yeah.
it doesn't sound like something a fantasy author would make up. It's not cool enough. Sorry, and I probably insulted one of my colleagues here, but
The word dollar is making me think it's fantasy. I feel like it's a fantasy author's place where there's loads of like banks or somewhere. I'm going to say
they're
realm.
never dollars in fantasy books. They're always
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
like
Oh, no,
marks
too late
or
now.
crowns or something.
Crowns,
You've
gold
committed
pieces.
now.
Coins. They're coins.
Damn. That's a good. That's a good point.
Dollarbeg is a real place and it is in Scotland.
Ballabeg's
Okay.
on the Isle of Man.
Number 3, Cache Desert, real or realm?
That's definitely real.
I'm pretty certain I've lived there.
What's the name again?
Cache Desert.
So you said it. I thought I've read that in a book, but then these two were like, no, that's definitely real. So I'll go with them.
No.
Something's
I
got to
don't
be
know.
a fantasy work eventually. So let's just go round and we go fantasy.
The Cache Desert is indeed a realm. It appears in Thomas Howard Riley's Lumina World.
Ah.
That's I see. I knew it. Yeah, I've read those. I knew I'd seen it somewhere.
Okay. Hazard, real or realm?
Real.
Has
There are
it?
gotta be
signs up
real.
for that all the time on the road. So it's hazard ahead. Yeah, it's easy to find.
There's a real
Good
footballer I know. I think that's realm. That sounds like some science fiction world.
I'll go real with Patrick. I don't know why. No basis.
Hazard is real and it is in Nebraska.
Ah,
There we are. Is that where the Dukes of Hazard are from?
Maybe.
Oh,
Hazard,
yeah.
Were they from Hazard or was that their name? God, I can't remember. I used to
no,
watch that.
it's Hazard County. It was Hazard.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh, good shout.
There you go.
So that makes it realm as well.
I mean, arguably, yes, but I haven't actually been keeping score on this, so I don't think it really matters at this point. However, next one, Chime, real or realm?
That's Realm.
It's gotta be realm. I feel like I've read that as well.
That's Trudy Skies, right?
Oh, Patrick, you get a bonus point for that. It is indeed in
Very
Trudy
good.
Skies' The 13th Hour.
Well done.
So,
I have read it.
Right.
Yeah, I've read that.
realm. And the last one, Emros City, real or realm?
Emerald City, did you say?
Emros.
Emerald City.
Emrys. That's got to be a realm, right?
That's a fantasy city.
What's a really well-known indie book? I've not read Cahill's yet. Is it going to be a place in there or something?
It is not. It is, however, an indie author realm. It is featured in Thomas J. Devon's Stone and Shield. And Thomas is obviously our Spotlight author for this month over on Spotlight Indie. And Stone and Shield is one of the books that we've been chatting about over our past few conversations. So if you've tuned into those videos, you may have heard it mentioned. But that brings us to the end of our game where there are no winners or losers because I didn't keep score. I thought you all did pretty well there. So I was very
think we did.
impressed.
Yeah.
I think what we've learned is we all have trouble differentiating between fantasy and reality, which I'm happy with.
Which is why we're writers. Yeah.
Yes, very much so. I relate to this. Before I do let you all go, I just want to quickly give people a chance to get to know where they can find your books and you. So if we go around, if we start with Ed, where can people find you and your books if they want to learn more about you?
I forgot to get my book. It's fine. It doesn't matter. So my for book 1 of the Everlands trilogy, Epic Fantasy with Vampires, Werewolves, and Sorcerers. It's not available in British books. It's traditionally published, not available in British bookshops. It's available in American bookshops. If you're, I don't know why you'd want to go to the trouble getting it in Britain, but I think you can get it on Blackwell's online. But if you're in America, great news. And yeah. And do I have anything else to say? You can find me on socials. Ed Crocker Books on Blue Sky, Instagram, and for my sins, TikTok. I'm trying to do videos on there. Not doing very well.
Patrick?
Well, you can find me, probably easiest place to find me is my website, patricksamphire.com. Spelling should be on the screen there. I've got a bunch of books. Shadow of a Dead God is the beginning of my most recent series. I've got a couple of other series. There's God, I can't remember now. So let's focus on that one and ignore the fact I've forgotten what my other ones are called.
And Simon?
I guess my website again. I've also failed to bring any books with me for this meeting to hold up, but my website is my name, Simon Kewin. That's slightly hard to spell. It's Kewin. SimonKewin.co.uk. And there's space opera and there's high fantasy and all points in between.
Perfect. So as mentioned, we will link everybody's websites and information.
What about you, Holly? What about you?
Yeah, Holly, yeah.
I'm building to it.
I'm sorry. I'm being modest. I was like, she's going to be modest.
No, not at all. No.
I noticed, however, that one earlier Holly made us say which was our favourite chapter from all of the other authors doing the Realm Raider, and she entirely neglected to say who her favourite was. And I think now is the time to do it.
I mean, I can say, but also I can also edit all of this out, so it's fine. I haven't read them all because I just haven't had the time or opportunity. Of the ones I've read, I don't think there's one that I haven't actually liked. But I've got to say, I love Derek Powers' chapter. And it's just not my style. I would never think that was my taste at all. That kind of, comedic, because I am similar to Ed, I'm quite a dark person, in writing anyway, not in life, obviously. But yeah, I really enjoyed his take on it, and it was quite refreshing. It's like a palate cleanser. That's how I would describe it. Right, I get back on track now. Where was I? Oh yes, anyway. So, yes, we will put all of the author websites and all the socials down in the description below. If you want to find out more about Realm Raiders, you can pop along to the Spotlight Indie website where you can subscribe to our newsletter. It goes out every month and it will have updates on current chapters that are coming out and all of the behind-the-scenes information. We have 2 more conversations coming out in video form with the other groups involved in the project as well, and we will be shouting it out on all of our social media. You can find us on X, Blue Sky, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also find me on all of the same socials as @HollyTinsley. And if you want to find any of my books, including the Vanguard Chronicles or the Hallows, they are available on Amazon. I want to thank all my guests once again for completely throwing me off my outro there and making it a real challenge. We will see you all again on Spotlight Indie for more videos. Until then, keep reading, keep writing, and keep discovering new realms.